Well, hello there, and welcome to another episode of the Quadruple D. This is episode 65, part 2, and this is part of the Critical Weight Theory podcast overall, like a show within a show. And in this episode, I'm going to ask that question: does Steve Witkoff put special into special envoy? So sometimes I hear terms like special envoy, and I'm like, well, what makes them so special? And it turns out that it's just that they're rich ass bitch boys, basically. You know, other than that, there's nothing special about him. Like, I don't think he has any real original thoughts. Like, he's probably never had an original idea in his whole life. And society rewards conformists a lot of the time, by the way. Just so you know, not all the time, but if you conform in a way that makes money for the system, then ooh boy, you can be rewarded. And that's exactly what makes Steve Witkoff special is he generates money for the system and it has rewarded him. So he's a special type of person. So Stephen Charles Witkoff was born in 1957 on March 15th. So just last month he had a happy birthday, and he built his public profile not through electoral politics, but through wealth accumulation and proximity to state power. So keep that in mind. Like these Republican, conservative, whatever you want to call them, right winger types, they always want to make it seem like they're outsiders, like they're rebels. But he's very much ensnared by the system of state power and corporate power. He's about as inside the system as you can be. So keep that in mind at all times, please. And by 2025, he held roles as a U.S. Special Envoy to the Middle East and for broader peace missions, as they like to call them, positions that are not elected but appointed, reflecting how diplomatic influence in the United States often overlaps with these elite networks rather than direct democratic accountability. He has also reportedly functioned informally as a channel to Vladimir Putin, highlighting how these unofficial envoys can operate alongside formal diplomacy. So, Witkoff's rise began in real estate, a sector deeply tied to financialization and urban inequality. After earning both a BA in political science and a law degree from Hofstra University, he started as a real estate attorney before moving into property development. So, this is one of those instances where I gotta say, you know what, whenever I see BA, I'm tempted to insert some joke about it being like BS. You know, it's but I'm not creative enough a lot of the time to just come up with a joke. So insert a joke there where you turn the BA in political science into BS. Insert joke here. But anyway, Witkoff accumulated major holdings in New York City, including landmark properties like the Woolworth Building and the Daily News Building. These acquisitions reflect the broader trends since the late 20th century, where investors purchase these high value urban properties not just for use but as financial assets, often contributing to rising rents and displacement. So by May 2025, his wealth was estimated at around $2 billion, placing him within the small fraction of individuals who control a disproportionate share of resources in the US economy. So when people accuse Trump of building a government and an economy that caters exclusively to billionaires, well, this would be another sign of that, right? It's sort of a direct validation of that accusation. And of course, these billionaires showed up at Donald Trump's second inauguration. It's almost like they were there to kiss the ring or whatever, like they were there to show that they are loyal to him, and maybe to some degree they want to view him as being loyal to them. But of course, Trump is really only loyal to himself. And, the US economy is increasingly being directed exclusively by and for the billionaire class. And Witkoff's involvement in government initiatives began during the first administration of Donald Trump when he joined a business advisory group formed in response to the economic crisis triggered by the COVID-19 pandemic. And these groups were composed largely of corporate executives rather than labor representatives, which has undoubtedly skewed policy responses toward business interests over workers' needs. So no great big surprise there. The entire uh, conservative slash right wing ideology is about pretending that workers' needs don't really matter that much. You gotta emphasize the business aspects of life. And in fact, that happens when some of these people run for office. They're always portraying themselves as smarter because, hey, I've had a successful business. But what really is going on, though, is they are running for office to feed their business interests, to get more wealth and get more power and more corporate control over the economy. Like I've said before on this podcast and elsewhere, I actually do understand the so called libertarian idea of not wanting to regulate corporations and businesses. And you know what? In an ideal world, that would make sense. I would be understanding the premise of that, the very basic core idea that you want to have, businesses flourish. You don't want them to be forced to go under because of bad government decisions and all that kind of stuff. But the problem is if you don't regulate corporations, they end up regulating you. And that's being 100% verified by especially the second Trump term. I mean, there's no denying it anymore. It's just the most obvious thing in the whole world, basically, that this administration is suppressing workers' needs and emphasizing the business interests. And that's long been true of the US corporate press. Now, I'm not going to say that the US media has never looked at workers' issues. Of course, they have sometimes because, well, it's complicated when it comes to the media. They have to at least try to present themselves as, objective and sometimes concerned and all that kind of stuff. But at the end of the day, a lot of stories about workers' issues and the environment have been suppressed over the years as the media environment has become increasingly corporation savvy, just dominated by corporate interests more and more and more. And that includes, of course, the concentration of these media outlets into, a smaller network where it's just like I don't know how many companies are involved, but it's like they're just dominating the entire marketplace of ideas. And really, the very fact that we're so obsessed with catering to these business interests in the first place is really sort of a sign of how much control they actually have. Because obviously, in a person's life, like when it comes to the average American citizen, the average American worker, and so on, they're not always going to be putting business interests first and foremost, right? You're not always going to want to put a price tag on everything. And in fact, a lot of people out there, if they knew how to make it happen, they might even prefer to not pay for everything. Maybe not everything needs to have a direct price tag on it. And, it's a question of integrity sometimes. Like, if you value money as the only thing in your life, then what does that say about you? It says that, well, your morality and your intellect and your time and your energy and all of your ambitions and all of your drives, well, they're up for sale or rent, and that's really one of those things that I guess is a core aspect of what could be called capitalist ideology. It's not enough that you go to work and you work long hours sometimes and whatnot. They want to get constantly more out of you for less. They don't want to pay you as much if they can get away with it. So what do you know, that's why these media corporations and these ideologies will de-emphasize workers' needs all the time. And in fact, they will pit people against each other. Have us bashing immigrants, have us bashing anyone in the LGBTQ community, you name it, just divide people along different national lines, different religions, all that kind of stuff. But at the end of the day, it's really just a way for them to get their hands into your wallet and take more money out of you. And in the second Trump administration, Witkoff became more directly involved in geopolitical negotiations, particularly around the Russia Ukraine war. So, reports of him taking positions seen as favorable to Russia, or even advising Russian negotiators, drew criticism. And it's a recurring pattern, really. State diplomacy often operates through these opaque channels where elite actors negotiate outcomes that affect millions without meaningful public oversight or participation. At the same time, Witkoff played a role in Middle East negotiations while maintaining business connections in the region. Well, fancy that. It's almost like he's the living embodiment of what I was talking about earlier, where these people get into office as a way to enrich themselves and maybe their families or their buddies or whatever, and his family's involvement in ventures like World Liberty Financial, a cryptocurrency firm linked to both his sons and Trump associates, it shows the blurred line between public office and private gain. It's a line that's blurring all the time. And cryptocurrency itself, while sometimes framed as decentralized, has increasingly been integrated into speculative finance and state aligned economic strategies rather than functioning as some genuinely liberatory alternative. I mean, for me, the first rat to be smelled with crypto is that they have the word crypto in front of it, like cryptozoology or something like that. Crypto sounds cryptic, and something that's cryptic sounds a little bit sketchy, doesn't it? That's really the first rat to be smelled there. And during this period, this renaissance of Witkoff's, if you will, his personal wealth reportedly grew by about 15% in a single year. Again, imagine that. The self-sacrifice on display here, when he's actually making more money from his office. Hmm. Is that a public servant or somebody who is serving himself in the name of public benefit? Anyway, this wealth increase is consistent with a broader pattern in which individuals with political access can benefit materially during times of crisis or conflict. And historically, war and geopolitical instability have often created opportunities for profit in sectors like real estate, finance, and energy. So, this guy was born in the Bronx and raised on Long Island, areas that have undergone significant economic shifts over the decades. New York City, in particular, has seen waves of gentrification since the 1980s, driven in part by developers like Witkoff, who invest in high value properties. while these projects can bring capital investment, they also tend to prioritize profit over community stability, often displacing lower income residents. And what do you know? That's sort of fitting with the accusation that these upper echelons are actually engaged in a class war against lower income people. I mean, you'll see that all the time. Just the war on the poor, the bashing of anybody who is already not too well off, and they alternate between you know em- emphasizing and sometimes overemphasizing how poor they are versus you know actually trying to make them seem like they're spoiled. They're welfare cheats. John Stossel back in the day when he was a person on Fox News, he acted like they were actually very well off because they might have things like refrigerators or something like that, you know, and he tried to claim that, nobody was genuinely homeless, that they were just putting on an act or something like that. And, it's also a thing where they try to claim that anyone who is homeless is just mentally ill or they've got drug problems or something like that. There's nothing systemic about it. You're never homeless because prices are too high or you're down on your luck. You got laid off from a job or you are discriminated against when it comes to employment or something like that. It's never that. It's always like you're mentally ill, you're an alcoholic, you're a drug user. The system surely has nothing to do with it ever. If you're living the life of a poor person, it's just due to poor choices you've made. There's no greater system that surrounds us. If there's a natural disaster or something, uh, it must have been you were just a bad person or something. If it wasn't the weather itself, you must have committed some sort of great sin and brought the sin upon you. Like, well, it sounds like maybe I'm getting sidetracked there, but it's kind of funny because it's actually not necessarily getting sidetracked because some of these religious nuts in the Republican Party, well, they actually sometimes have beliefs like that. Like, I remember Jerry Falwell back in the day, he was trying to blame 9/11 on the existence of like lesbians and feminists and gay people and stuff. He was acting as if September 11th was because those types of people exist. So these people they're goofballs in a lot of ways. Some of the dumbest people out there, but stupid people give them money. So I mean, what can you do? But anyway, Witkoff's trajectory is less about individual ambition and more about structural conditions that keep on rewarding people like him. If you're able to make money for the system and you live your life according to those rules, and sometimes you have to throw out the rule book in order to do that. But if you make consistently enough cash for these other scumbags, well, you can become like a scumbag leader yourself. And his career, it really shows how economic power can translate into political influence and how state systems frequently rely on these unelected wealthy figures to shape policy and diplomacy. Rather than being an exception, his role fits into a broader pattern where governance and capital are tightly intertwined, raising concerns about accountability, inequality, and who actually benefits from decisions made at the highest levels. All right, that about wraps it up for this episode. I will do a part 3 probably tomorrow where I will focus on Vladimir Putin himself and some of his biggest scandals. So, yeah,